Alright guys, welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at functions, relations, and graphs, and specifically functions today. Now it's a fairly lengthy topic, but it is not a difficult topic to go through. And as I said before, we want to be focusing on functions. And before I give you the assignment later, I just wanted to think of functions as, for example, an equation. Alright. Now, before we actually get into the CXC type questions, I just want to point something out because once you're able to read these things, the interpretation of a question is not too difficult. All right, so for example, if you have this here, this is read f of x. So this is read f of x. Similarly, if you have this, it is read g of x, h of x, and m of x. Okay, so that is what we're going to be using in terms of describing each of these. So when you look at a problem, we're able to read it. So let's take a look at example 1. And this is how CXC would phrase some of these questions. So when you're ready to solve it, it's going to be coming very easy as you go along, and mundane, so to speak. So let's take a look at example 1. So it says, given f of x is equal to 3x plus 2, and as you can see, it resembles an equation, right? So essentially it is an equation. Now, given f of x is equal to 3x plus 2, determine, part 1 says f of 0, part 2 says f of 4, and part 3 says the value of x when f of x is equal to 0, and part 5 says the inverse, which is written this way with a -1 superscripted. Now they don't have to say the inverse. You should know that this means the inverse of the function. So this means the inverse of f of x. And of course, part 5 says determine the inverse of f of 1. So we're going to take these in stages and show you how we do the solution to these questions. So I'm going to kind of just put that over there so we can still look at the question while we work. So let's take a look at the solution of this question. Now again, the function is f of x, which is equal to 3x plus 2. That's the function. Now I'm just going to ask a simple question here before I actually go any further with the solution to these questions. When you look at this f of x, and you compare it with part 1, which says f of 0, what in your opinion is the big difference? Now, the big difference is that x is being substituted with 0. So when you look at both of them, the difference is that x is being replaced with 0, and that is exactly what we're going to do in the right hand side here, which is 3x plus 2. So for part 1, we're asked to determine f of 0, and all that means is that we're going to be replacing x with 0. So that is going to be equal to 3 times 0 plus 2. Very simple. And of course, 3 times 0 is 0, and plus 2, that would simply give you 2. So essentially, therefore, f of 0 is equal to 2. It's as simple as that. And part 2 says determine f of 4, which is done the same way. So part 2, we're asked to find f of 4. So all we're doing is replacing x with 4. So it will be 3 times 4 plus 2. 3 4 is 12 plus 2, and that is simply 14. So it therefore means f of 4 is equal to 14. So we've answered the first 2 parts of the question. Now part 3 says determine the value of x when the function itself is equal to 0. Now what that means is they want you to equate this part to 0 and then solve for x. So it says determine the value of x when the function itself, which means all of this part here, is equal to 0. And that's what we're going to do. So we're simply going to make the function itself equal to 0 and then make x the subject, or simply solve for x. So 3x here, we're going to carry over the positive 2. It's going to become negative. Of course, there was 0 on the right-hand side, so that's just going to be negative 2. And x now will simply be equal to negative 2 over 3. So we have answered this part of the question. Now part 4 is interesting because it's asking us to find the inverse of the function, and that requires a few steps. So we've answered part 1, we've answered this part 2 and part 3, and part 4 requires some working out. Now if you look at part 5, it says determine the inverse of f of 1, and quite frankly you couldn't determine part 5 unless you have the function itself, and I'm going to say exactly what I mean. So I'm going to use a different paper because that is going to involve a few steps. So let's take a look at the solution to part 4. Okay, so determining, just to make that statement so it sticks in the head, determining the inverse, which is written like this. So just for emphasis here, just to make sure everybody's following, let me just make a note here. If you have a function called f of x, then its inverse is denoted this way. So this would be read the inverse of f of x. Similarly, if you have a function called g of x, then if you see this on paper, it means the inverse of g of x. Okay? So just for being able to read it. So let's come back to the solution to part 4 now. It says determining the inverse of f of x. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to write the original function, which is f of x, which is 3x plus 2, because that's the original function. And we're now going to find the inverse of that. So here are the steps now. Let y equals the 3x plus 2. That's the first thing we're going to do. Right? These are just some steps that allow you to find the inverse. But after a while, you're going to notice a trend with the original function and what you get for the inverse after a while. After you worked a few questions, you're going to see that. So f of x is equal to 3x plus 2, and then we're asked to determine, we're making let y equals 3x plus 2 because we want to find the inverse. So the function is 3x plus 2, and the first step is to let y equals 3x plus 2. That's the first step. The next step is to interchange x and y, which means interchange the positions of x and y, which means wherever y is, we're going to put x, and wherever x is, we're going to put y. So if you look at this, it would now become x here equals 3y plus 2. And the final step is now to solve for y, which means make y the subject, which means at the end of the day, you want y to be equal to something. So solve for y, which means to make y the subject. So we have x equals 3y plus 2. And what we're going to be doing is make y the subject. So I'm going to move the 2 because you can't touch the 3 yet. So I'm going to carry over the positive 2. It's going to become negative, just like that. And finally, we're going to divide both sides by 3, or divide the left-hand side by 3, and that's what y is going to be equal to. So x minus 2 divided by 3 is equal to y, and whatever y is equal to, that is going to be the inverse function. So therefore, the inverse of f of x is going to be equal to x minus 2 over 3. Now, after you've done a few questions in terms of finding the inverse of a few function, you're going to be more comfortable. This is the first time, so it's okay if you only pick up on a few things. That's fine. Right? So now that I've found the inverse of the function, I can go ahead, this is finished, I can go ahead and find the inverse of f of 1 because I have the inverse function. So for part 5, since the inverse of the function is equal to x minus 2 over 3, then the inverse of 1 simply means wherever x is, I'm going to put 1. So over here, 1 minus 2 over 3, and of course 1 minus 2 is negative 1 over 3, which is the same thing as saying a negative 1/3 fraction. And that would be the answer to the final part of the question, and that would be example 1. All right, nothing difficult in it, but it's the first example. So all I want you to do is pick up a couple of things. When we get to the next example, then you'll start to see it working in terms of you understanding a little bit more in terms of working with functions. All right, so I hope you guys found this video insightful. When we get back, we look at a second example.